The morning Cecilia Voss walked into the sale barn with $40 in her coat pocket, she was not looking for a horse. She was looking for a way to get through February without losing anything else. The auction was loud the way those places always are. Men in good boots moving through the cold light of fluorescent tubes, the smell of cedar shavings and animal fear hanging in the air like something you could almost taste. Cecilia moved along the back pens because that was where the culls went, the ones the ringmen didn't bother to flag. She found the foal in the last slot before the loading dock. A bay filly, 3 months old by the look of her teeth and the knob of her knees, which were swollen in a way that suggested she had been on wet ground too long. Her coat was rough along the spine. Her eyes were clouded at the inner corners with the yellowish crust that comes from a fever that has been winning. She was standing in the way-sick animal stand when they have stopped deciding about anything. Weight on 3 legs, head too low. The 4th leg held just clear of the shavings as if the floor itself caused her pain. The ringman walked past the pen twice without stopping. A buyer from the west side of the county looked in, sucked his teeth, and moved on. Nobody wanted her. Nobody was going to bid. At the price of her keep for another week, the sale barn would send her to the processor by Friday. Cecilia stood at the gate for a long time. She was not sentimental about horses. She had grown up on a dryland place east of Mare Creek, where horses were tools first and companions only incidentally, and the tools that could not be fixed were let go, because grief was a luxury that small operations could not afford. She knew that. She had lived it. She pressed her thumb against the latch and felt the cold of the metal go through her glove, and she stood there for what felt like a full minute of silent argument with herself. She opened the gate. She had $40. The ringman, when she finally found him, looked at the filly, looked at Cecilia, and said 40 was more than he'd expected to see for that particular animal. He wrote it on a slip and she paid him in tens. The drive home took an hour on roads that still had ice in the low patches. The filly stood in the bed of the truck, braced against the cab, too tired to be frightened. Cecilia could see her in the mirror, the small dark head visible above the sidewalls, the ears moving once when a truck passed going the other direction, then going still again. When they got to the place, Cecilia put the filly in the near barn, in the foaling stall that had not been used since her mother's time. She had a notebook her mother had kept, fat with practice and filled end to end in a hand that was small and precise and slanted just slightly to the left. The notebook had lived in the drawer beneath the workbench for 11 years. Cecilia had not opened it in all that time because the last entry was from the week her mother died, and she had not been ready to read that far. She was ready now. She took the notebook from the drawer and brought it to the barn and sat on a hay bale in the lamplight and read until the filly, standing in the stall beside her, lowered her head to sniff at Cecilia's sleeve. Her mother had written about fever in young horses with the kind of precision that comes from tending to a thing over many years, from losses paid for and lessons purchased at the cost of sleep and worry, and animals that could not be saved. She had written about the specific type of joint swelling that appears in underfed foals exposed to cold moisture in their first season, the kind that looks like structural failure but is, in almost every case, an infection the body is still trying to outrun. She had written the remedies in plain terms: warmth, clean bedding changed daily, a broth made from bone, and certain dried herbs she named specifically, introduced through a bottle when the animal would not or could not drink from a bucket. She had written the timeline, 3 weeks of this no less, before you would know whether the fever was going to turn. There was a sentence near the bottom of the page that Cecilia read twice. Her mother had written it as if it were simply one more fact in a long list of facts, without emphasis or drama. A sick body remembers what helped it. You are not just treating the sickness, you are teaching the body a thing it will not forget. Cecilia looked at the filly. The filly looked at nothing in particular. She closed the notebook and went to get the materials her mother had listed. The county extension agent, a man named Gerald Pruitt, came by 9 days later on a routine check for a pasture permit that Cecilia had filed in October. He was a large man in a state green truck, unhurried and certain in the manner of someone whose salary does not depend on the weather. He walked through the barn because Cecilia showed him through, and he stopped in front of the foaling stall and looked at the filly for a while with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said she was sorry looking. Cecilia said she was improving. He said that joint condition in a foal that age, without veterinary intervention, typically did not improve. He said he was not trying to be harsh, only realistic. He said he knew she had been through a difficult stretch, and it was understandable that she might want to hold on to something, but that sometimes the compassionate choice was the hard one. He said it in the tone of a man who considered himself compassionate. Cecilia said she appreciated him stopping. He looked at the notebook on the hay bale, and looked at the foal, and looked at Cecilia. He said if she needed anything, the county had resources. He wrote a phone number on the back of his card and left it on the workbench. Cecilia did not call the number. She changed the bedding and made the broth and filled the bottle and went back in. The neighbor woman, Dorla Fitch, came over on a Sunday 3 weeks after that with a covered dish and an expression Cecilia recognized as preemptive mourning. Dorla was a generous woman who had been preemptively mourning things for as long as Cecilia had known her, which was going on 30 years. She set the dish on the kitchen table and then followed Cecilia to the barn because she would not be satisfied without seeing the foal herself. She stood at the stall door and watched the filly eat from a bucket, which she was now doing on her own, and Dorla said that she supposed the poor thing might last another while yet. Said it with a warmth that was meant kindly and landed like a small, soft stone. The filly's name by then was Mare. Cecilia had not planned to name her. The name had arrived on the 14th night when the fever broke and the filly stood up from the corner where she had been lying for 2 days and walked to the water bucket on 4 legs, including the 4th one, without favoring. Cecilia had been sitting on the hay bale watching, and she said the word out loud without meaning to, as a statement of fact. Tomorrow. And then, because the filly's ear turned toward the sound, she said it again, softer, and the spelling settled differently in her mind. Mare. For the creek the place was named for the sense of something arriving. The knee swelling was gone entirely by spring. By April, Mare was moving through the near pasture with the kind of energy that looks like it is trying to use up a surplus that had been saved during a long, difficult winter. She was not a beautiful horse in the catalog sense of the term. Her markings were plain, the blaze narrow and slightly off-center. Her barrel was not deep, and her shoulder slope was not the fashionable angle that the show people preferred. But she had a quality that Cecilia had seen in only a few horses across a long life of working with them. She paid attention. She watched things. She moved her ears not in the scattered, anxious way of a nervous horse, but in the deliberate, swiveling way of an animal that is genuinely trying to understand something. Cecilia began handling her properly in May. Not riding. Just the long, slow grammar of touch and weight and voice and expectation that is the first curriculum of any horse that will ever be asked to carry a person. Cecilia was 61 years old, and her left hip gave her trouble on damp mornings, and she had no patience for shortcuts. She had seen too many horses made wrong in the early months by people in a hurry. She was not in a hurry. She worked with Mare every day in the barn lot, sometimes for 20 minutes and sometimes for an hour, and she kept notes in the back pages of her mother's notebook in her own handwriting, which was larger and less tidy than her mother's, but no less careful. A man named Frank Ash, who ran the biggest quarter horse operation in the region, and who had a particular confidence about the subject of horses that had been reinforced by 30 years of moderate success, came by in June to look at Cecilia's fencing situation on the shared line between their properties. He saw Mare in the barn lot. He watched for a while from the fence line with an expression that was not quite a smile. He said he didn't realize she had gone back to the rescue business. Cecilia said she hadn't. He said the filly moved well enough for what she was, but that confirmation like that usually meant a ceiling, meant you were going to hit a limit somewhere in the training and have to decide whether to push through it or accept it, and that most people didn't have the patience for accepting. He said he had seen that type before. Cecilia said she supposed he had. He nodded and went to look at the fence line and later sent his hired man to repair the posts on his side without charging for materials, which was the kind of generosity that was also a form of pity, and Cecilia understood it as such. She kept working with Morrow. There was a boy named August Ferris who came to the place in July looking for summer work, sent by his grandmother, who had been a friend of Cecilia's mother and who knew that Cecilia had more to tend than one person could manage in summer. He was 15 and lean and not talkative, which Cecilia considered a reasonable quality in a person. He worked the mornings on fence and water troughs, and the afternoons he spent watching Cecilia work Morrow. He did not ask questions out loud, but she could see them forming behind his eyes, and so she began to explain things as she did them, not as instruction exactly, more as narration, the way her mother had narrated the chores when Cecilia was small, stating what she was doing and why, and what she expected to happen next, and whether what happened next was what she had expected. August listened in the same way Morrow listened, precisely, as if storing. By September of that first year, Morrow was carrying Cecilia at the walk and trot both directions on a loose rein without a moment's argument. Not because she had been forced into it, but because the work had been built in sequence, each thing resting on the thing before it, and the sequence had made sense to her. Cecilia could feel it in the horse's back, the difference between an animal that was tolerating and an animal that had genuinely accepted the arrangement. It was a physical fact you could feel through the saddle if you had the years behind you to know what you were feeling. She wrote in the notebook, "Today, she moved like she chose to." The following spring, a drought began that no one took seriously until it was serious. The county had had dry springs before, and the forecast models had been wrong in both directions often enough that most of the people who made decisions based on them had developed a kind of sophisticated disregard for their predictions. Frank Ash drilled a new well in March at considerable expense, trusting the geological survey his operation had paid for, which identified what the survey called a highly probable aquifer at depth. His people hit rock and a trace of moisture and an invoice for $11,000. He told the bank in May that the creek pastures would carry his herd through summer and that the situation was manageable. Cecilia had read the notebook all the way through that winter for the second time. There was a section near the end, written in the same small hand, about what her mother called the dry sequence, a particular combination of winter wind patterns and snowpack deficit that she had learned, from her own father's records and from 40 years of watching Morrow Creek herself, preceded the worst droughts on that stretch of land by one growing season. Her mother had named the signs plainly and had written what to do when they appeared, and had noted that the neighbors always thought she was being excessive. The signs had appeared in October. Cecilia had spent the winter doing what her mother described. She had inventoried and repaired every cistern on the property, 3 concrete tanks her grandfather had poured in the 1940s that had not been used in a generation because the creek and the drilled well had made them seem unnecessary. She had hauled water from town in January and February to fill them while the roads were still passable, and the demand on town water was low, and the price was accordingly low. She had bought hay in November at off-season rates, enough to carry the horses and the small flock of sheep through a full summer without pasture. She had planted the south kitchen garden in a careful rotation of drought-tolerant varieties her mother had specified, laid in a deep mulch, and built a simple gravity drip system from salvaged materials that used the cistern water slowly rather than all at once. She had also, quietly, begun riding Morrow on the creek pastures and the ridge trails in the long evenings of February and March, and had discovered that the horse had a quality she had hoped for but had not permitted herself to expect: stamina built on something structural, something below the surface, the residue of a body that had been tested at its most foundational level and had been given what it needed to survive. Morrow could go all day on modest water. She moved across rough ground with a particular attentiveness to her footing that Cecilia suspected was a memory in the body, a memory of what it costs to have hurt legs. A sick body remembers what helped it. August Ferris came back that summer, 16 now, quieter and more capable. He had told his grandmother about the cisterns and the hay, and his grandmother had told a woman at her church, and that woman's husband had quietly asked Cecilia whether she might be willing to sell him some hay at a fair price in July, if things went as dry as some people were worried they might. Cecilia had said she would hold some back and name a fair price when the time came. The creek dropped in May. It dropped further in June. By July 4th, it was a series of still brown pools that a dog could step across in most places. Frank Ash's creek pastures were dust by the third week of July. His hay supplier in the valley had shorted him because every operation in the valley was short. He was paying twice the November price for what he could find and spending his mornings on the phone. He drove over to Cecilia's place on a Wednesday afternoon in the kind of heat that makes the air above a dirt road look like something is trying to escape from the ground. He came to the door and she answered it, and he stood on the porch and did not say anything for a moment, which was the most honest thing she had seen him do in the years she had known him. He said he was in a difficult spot. She said she knew. He said he had heard she had put up hay. She said she had. He asked if she had more than she needed. She said she had set some aside. He asked what she was asking for it. She told him the November price, not the July price, the November price, which was exactly what she had paid. He looked at her for a long time with an expression that was doing two things at once, struggling with itself. He said he didn't understand why she would do that. She said she didn't need anything from the exchange except the hay to be useful. She said his animals needed it. She said that seemed like enough of a reason. He said he would send his man with the trailer in the morning. She said she would have it stacked at the gate. He turned to go and then turned back and said he had been wrong about the filly. He said it as if each word had a particular weight, and he was placing them down carefully. He said whatever she had done with her was not what he had expected. Cecilia said she hadn't done anything unusual. She had paid attention and been patient. She said her mother had written down everything that mattered. He nodded and went to his truck, and she watched him drive out. The man from the church, a quiet rancher named Oral Dietz, came the following day, and she sold him hay at the same November price. She sold the last of the surplus to two other families at the same rate, noting each transaction in the back of the notebook with the date and the name and the price. She had calculated in the fall how much she would need, and she had bought that much more above it, not as speculation, but as preparation for the fact that she would not be the only one who needed it. The cisterns ran the place through August and into September. The well held because she had not drawn on it beyond necessity. The kitchen garden produced through heat that killed the neighboring plots by mid-July. The sheep and the horses were thin by September but sound. Mare, at 2.5, had the lean, finished look of a horse that had been through something and arrived at the other side of it with more rather than less. In October, when the rain returned and the creek came back and people began to assess what they had lost, a woman from the agricultural college who was writing a report on drought preparedness strategies in the region came to the place to interview Cecilia. The woman was polite and thorough and very young, and she had a clipboard, and she asked good questions. She asked where Cecilia had found the cistern data, and the hay procurement strategy, and the planting schedule. Cecilia showed her the notebook. The woman looked at it for a long time and then asked if she could make a copy. Cecilia said she could have the original. She had already copied it herself, twice, once in her own hand and once on the copy machine at the library in town. She said she had written down the parts she wanted to add from her own years, and that the notebook now had two voices in it, and was the better for that. The woman asked if she could quote from it in the report. Cecilia said she could. She said she would like her mother's name attached to the portions her mother had written. The woman wrote the name down. Ruth Agnes Voss. She wrote it carefully. August Ferris came back the following spring and the spring after that, and by the time he was 18, he was riding Morrow in the hill pastures for the late-day cattle checks, because Cecilia's hip had gotten worse, and the rough ground at speed was more than it could manage for long stretches. He rode her without special equipment and without drama. She was not a horse that required drama. She moved up the steep switchbacks with that attentive, deliberate footwork, reading the ground, and she had a quality that August tried once to describe to his grandmother and settled for this. She felt like she was thinking about the same thing you were thinking about. Cecilia watched them from the gate sometimes in the evening, the boy and the horse moving along the ridge, and she thought about what her mother had written about the difference between a life that is spent and a life that is passed on, and how the two things looked similar from the outside but felt entirely different from the inside. She was not a woman who said such things out loud. She thought them, and then she went back to the barn and did the evening feeding. Morrow was 12 years old when a man driving through the county stopped at the gate on a day in June because he had a flat tire and needed to borrow a pump. He was a horse trainer of some reputation who was traveling from a clinic in one county to a clinic in the next. While he waited for the tire to hold pressure, he watched Morrow moving in the near pasture with the ease of a horse that has never had a wasted year in her life, and he asked Cecilia what she was asking for her. Cecilia said she was not for sale. He said he had rarely seen movement like that in a plain-bred bay mare. Cecilia said she was not surprised. He asked how she had developed it. Cecilia said the horse had done most of it herself. She had been given the right early conditions and the rest had followed. He drove away, and Cecilia went into the barn and sat on the hay bale in the foaling stall and looked at the stall door and thought about the morning 11 years ago, with the $40 and the ice on the low patches of road and the small, dark head visible above the truck's sidewalls. She opened the notebook to the last pages, the ones in her own handwriting, and she read back what she had added over the years, and she read her mother's line again. A sick body remembers what helped it. You are not just treating the sickness, you are teaching the body a thing it will not forget. She thought that was true of bodies and true of land and true of certain other things she did not have a precise word for. She added 3 lines in her own hand at the bottom of the page, beneath her mother's entry, extending the thought the way a fence line is extended. The work you do quietly, when no one thinks the work is necessary, is the only work that will matter when necessity arrives. Do not argue about this. Do not explain it. Simply do the work. The drought report from the Agricultural College was published that year and cited the notebook twice and named Ruth Agnes Voss in both places. A copy of the report was filed in the county extension office where Gerald Pruitt still worked, in a manila envelope in a lateral file cabinet under the letter V. He had read it. He had not gone back to the property. There was nothing to say that he could say. The notebook itself was copied again in Cecilia's 68th year, this time properly by the County Historical Society, which had been told about it by August Ferris's grandmother, who was 91 and still attending the church and still passing on the things that were worth passing on. The society made an archival facsimile and placed the original behind glass in the small room at the back of the historical building, where they kept things that told the story of how people on this land had gotten through the hard years. They wrote a label for the case that described the notebook as a record of practical knowledge in drought management and animal husbandry spanning 3 generations, maintained by 2 women on a single property east of Morrow Creek. Cecilia had asked them to keep it simple. She did not want a long explanation. The label they chose suited her. In the photograph they took for the exhibit, Cecilia is standing at the near pasture gate in a canvas coat with her hand resting on Morrow's neck. And Morrow is looking at something past the camera with that particular expression, ears turned forward, attentive, as if she is paying close attention to something the rest of the room has not yet noticed. The label reads, "Some knowledge stays useful because one person refused to let it go quiet."